Okay, so for this first problem, we want to factor this thing right here. And when we're going to factor this thing, the biggest thing is when you have a number in front, it's not as simple as multiply and add. You have to think what things multiply together to give you this first number and multiply together to give you this back number. So really what ends up happening is you got to multiply these things out to see if the things that you guess works, and it's called the guess and check. Well, the nice part is they give you the things that you should guess when it's multiple choice. So we're going to start with A and kind of check to see if this one works. So how you check is you just multiply these things out. And when I multiply this out, I'm going to get 4x squared minus 18x plus 14x minus 63. And when you finally write that, you're going to get 4x squared minus 4x minus 63. And you're going to notice that this is not the same as ours up here. It's close, but not the same. So that one is no good. So then we'll just kind of go through and try the next one. So the next one just switches some of these things around. And it will be minus 7 and x. Well, I don't even need to check that one because 2x times x wouldn't give us 4x, so that one can't work. So the last one has to work, but we'll double check to make sure. Well, this again would be 4x squared plus 18x minus 14x minus 63. And you could see that this really would work out and be exactly what we wanted to. So that's the reason C is the correct answer. Try the next one. Okay, so for this problem, we have to figure out what would make these things equal 0. Worst case scenario, again, since it's multiple choice, you could just plug each of these numbers in until it worked out. But the much faster way would be to just factor this thing and find the zeros. So how you would factor this is you would want to think what multiplies together to give you 27 and adds together to give you negative 6. That would obviously be, well, I guess it would be z minus 9 and z plus 3. And those both need to equal 0. So 9 and negative 3 would be your correct answers. Try the next one. Again, we need to factor this thing. So you could always check, since it's multiple choice, by multiplying these things out. The faster way would be, though, to look and factor out the greatest common factor, which in this case, if we look at this thing, would be 2x, because they each share a factor of 2 and an x. So this would give me x squared plus x minus 12. And then you could easily see that this thing could factor down into positive 4 and negative 3 because those multiply together to give you 12 and add together to give you a single x, which would make our correct answer A, I think. Yeah, A instead of C. So let's try the next one. For 4, for this question, there's a number of ways to solve it. Way number 1 is, since it's a quadratic, you could use the quadratic formula, and that would always work. Way number 2 is you could try to factor this, but if it doesn't factor, then we would be in trouble. And way number 3 is we could take out our graphing calculator, and we could just graph this thing and see where it crosses the axis. That's the one that I'm probably going to do, just because it's significantly faster than the other ways. So I can just hit graph. It's taking a little bit. Wonder what happened. Stat plots are off. Graph. I typed something in wrong. Oh, 17x. There we go. Okay. Now let's hit graph and see what happens. Okay, and so we can see that it hits here at what looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, or at negative 4, and then at negative 2/3, right in there. So I'd say B is the correct answer. We'll solve it one more way just to double check that that's the correct answer, but that's what I would go for. Let's use the quadratic formula just since it has a number in front, and that's normally easiest to do when it has a number in front. So that's negative 17 plus or minus the square root of 17 squared, which is going to be a big number, so let me do that on the calculator. So that's 289. Minus 4 times a times c all over 2a, and 2a would give me 6. So this would be negative 17 plus or minus the square root of, and we'll let the calculator handle that, which would be 289 minus 4 times 3 times 20, which would be 49 over 6, which this would then equal negative 17 plus 7 over 6, and negative 17 minus 7 over 6, which, if we did this properly, that would be negative 10 over 6, which would reduce down to be negative 1 2/3. And this would be negative 24 over 6, which would reduce to be negative 4. So as we can see, the graphing calculator way was the fastest way by far, but if you wanted to use the quadratic formula on it, you would still get the same answer. Let's try the next one. This one, there's no math involved. You just have to know what the discriminant means. And the discriminant means how many answers that you would get from this kind of quadratic, which we now should know that you would get 2 answers from this quadratic because it crosses this x-axis twice. And if you think about even looking where it says the discriminant, which is b squared minus 4ac, we get that from the square root part of it. And if the square root part of this thing equaled a negative number, you'd get no answers because that's imaginary. So that's not going to work. If it was 0, you'd get 1 answer because plus minus 0 is still 0. So it has to be this positive 4 because a positive number should give you 2 answers. Let's try the next one. So this question is asking the same thing, or how many answers will you get from this quadratic? So again, I think the easiest way to deal with this is to graph this thing and see what it looks like. So we're going to say x squared minus 12x plus 36. Whoops. Delete the 360 off and just see what it would look like. And what it looks like is it hits this axis one time and bounces off. So it looks like this thing is going to have a single answer. Now we can double check this again by doing the discriminant, which would be b squared minus 4ac, or this would be 144 minus 4 times 1 times 36, which would be 144 minus 144, which would be 0, and we just discussed in the last problem how 0 plus or minus 0 is the same thing, so this really would be one answer. Let's try the next one. So for this problem, Thomas has taken 4 tests, and we want to, or 5 tests, and what we want to know is what he needs to get on the 6th test to average an 87. So what you want to do is you first want to think about how you find an average, and you find an average by adding all of the numbers up and then dividing by how many numbers there are. Now if I'm adding all the numbers up, the most common mistake is to forget about the last number, because we haven't just taken 5 tests, we're going to take 6 tests. Now I don't know how big the 6th test will be, so I'm going to add an x, and this is representing my 6th test. Well, if we've taken 6 tests, then we need to divide by 6, and what we want to get is we want this to get 87. Now when you look at this and you think about how you would solve a problem like this, would be to get rid of the fraction, and how you get rid of a fraction is undoing division, so we're going to multiply both sides by 6. That's going to give us 87 times 6, which is 522. And that's going to equal, Well, now we should add all these things up to see what this kind of equals. For 48 plus x, and we again got that by multiplying this thing by 6. These things canceled. And then we added this up, plus x. Now all we have to do is subtract to get this by itself. Whoops. And we're going to get that x equals, if we do this right, so 522 minus 448, 74. So the person needs to get a 74, or if they want to score better than that, higher than a 74. Let's try that. So we want to find a quadratic regression for this data and then find the missing value for y. So to do this, the easiest way is, first we need a quadratic regression. So we're going to go into stats, and we're going to go to edit and make sure, again, your lists are cleared. If they're not, you just hit clear on the list and make it go away. And then we're going to type in all of the numbers. So our x values are -2, 0, 2, and 4. And notice how I didn't put in 6 because I don't know what that is yet. So you don't want to have your list unequal. And so then our y values would be -8, 0, 12, and 28. Then we're going to hit stat again, then go over to calculate and go to quad regression. And then when I go to quad regression, it will give me a quadratic regression, which is y equals 0.5x squared plus 5x plus 0, which we can see again by these numbers. And then all you would have to do is plug in 6 into your calculator where there are x's. And that would give you the correct final answer of 48. Let's try the next problem. This is another one that's just a pure definition question. And so when you look across, it says which of the following systems have infinitely many solutions, which a solution is where the lines cross. Whoops. Where the lines cross. There we go. So when we look, we want infinitely many times, so we want the lines to cross infinitely many times, which would be B, because these things cross a whole bunch. Let's try the next one. So again, this is a nice problem because it's a nice definition problem. And the definition is what a standard deviation is. And so a standard deviation is how spread apart the data is. So class B would have the lower standard deviation because it is less spread out. See how A is just so far spread out? So A probably has a very high standard deviation, where class B has a very low standard deviation, or things are very closely related. Try the next one. Okay, so in this equation that we need to solve, there's a couple ways you can go through and do this. Way number 1, guess and check. Throw in all of these numbers and see which ones work when you plug them in for x. That is probably the slowest way to do it, but it will always be right. The fastest way would be to solve this and to get rid of these fractions. So if you want to know how to get rid of a fraction is telling you to divide. So we want to do the opposite of dividing, which is multiplying. So if you want to get rid of this 5, you can get rid of it by multiplying everything through by 5. Now, here's the only problem with doing it this way. If you multiply through everything by 5 and things start canceling, you have to then do it for the 10 and then do it for the 20. So the fastest way is pick the biggest denominator and times everything by that denominator. Because multiplication is a scalar operator, so it affects everything. And then go through, well, 20x divided by 20x, well, that cancels. 20 divided by 15 is 300. 20 divided by 10 is 2, so that would be 2x. And 20 divided by 5 is 4, so that's 4x. Now we would just combine like terms, so I'd subtract this x over here and this x over here. I'd subtract this 2 over here and subtract it over there.
to get rid of all the x's. That would give you 300 equals negative 5x. And then when you divide by negative 5, you're going to get x is equal to negative 60. And this would be your correct answer, which would be D. Let's try the next problem.
It should be fixed. Okay, so for this last problem, again, like all the other ones, if you get multiple choice, you can always plug in your x values and see which one works. But the better way to solving the absolute value is just actually solve the absolute value. Now, if you ever have an absolute value by itself, what you can do is you can undo the absolute value. And how you undo an absolute value is you make one answer to be positive and one answer to be negative, because an absolute value takes anything and makes it positive. So the opposite of that would be thinking about both possible answers that it would make positive. And so to do this, you would then just solve, so you get the x's on the same side, which would give you negative 1x over here, and then we'd minus 2 and minus 2, and get 3, and then we get x equals negative 3. And then when we do this on this side, and let's add that over here, we'd get 7x equals negative 7, or x equals negative 1. Now, at this point, the hard part about this is, well, a lot of people are instantly going to go, oh, I got my answers A, and that is not correct. And the reason this is not correct is the only answers that actually work are what does not make this side negative, because an absolute value can never equal a negative number, because the absolute value makes everything positive, so it literally can't be a negative number. So what you have to do is you have to check. Well, if we threw negative 3 into there, that'd be negative 12, and negative 12 plus 5, well, that's still going to be a negative 7, and this can't be a negative 7, so this will not work. If you throw negative 1 in there, though, negative 1 times 4 is negative 4, plus 5 is a positive 1, so this one can work. So again, you can solve the absolute values, but once you solve the absolute values, you do need to plug them into this right-hand side, or the answer side, and see if any become negative, because if any become negative, it doesn't actually work. If you have any questions, please let me know.